Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Wasserstrom, and I'm at the University of California, Irvine. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which we're calling a book slam about the Japanese Empire. The idea for it was partly inspired by an event at Columbia University that Sarah Kovner, who's part of this event, put together, and Kelly Hammond, who's also part of this event, was part of as well. And that was about new books on Japan. And we thought this way we would talk about books about the Japanese Empire, which would also be a way to bring in Korea and China into the discussion as well. So the format, just so that you know, if you've signed up, presumably you know something about who's involved and what's going on. But we're going to go with the 4 authors of 2020 books, introducing themselves and their books. And we'll have them do short presentations about them. And then we'll switch to having 2 comments by discussants. Seiji Shirani and Alexis Dudden were good enough to make time to comment and sort of start the discussion part of the event off that way. I'll let the speakers introduce themselves. I'll just let you know that we'll be going from West Coast eastward, as well as in alphabetical order. So we'll be going from David Fedman to Sarah Kovner to Kelly Hammond to Rana Mitter. And most of the speakers will hold up a copy of their books, but since Kelly was locked out of her office that has the book, I will hold up a copy of hers to show you. All right, take it away, David, and then move on without me cluttering things. Oh, and when it's the Q&A time, or at any point actually, anybody in the audience joining us from around Irvine or around the world, put your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to you when we have time, when we go into the Q&A function. All right, take it away, David.
Well, thank you. Hello, I'm David Fedman, Assistant Professor of History at the University of California at Irvine. I want to start with a word of thanks to my colleague, Jeff Wasserstrom, for once again envisioning and willing into existence a fascinating event. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak about my new book, and especially to do so alongside such an incredible panel of fellow authors and historians. I'm going to talk about Seeds of Control, Japan's Empire of Forestry in Colonial Korea, published with the University of Washington Press just this year. I suppose this is where I slam the book down if we're doing this properly. In essence, Seeds of Control is my attempt to write the environment more fully into, or write empire more fully into Japanese environmental history, and to write the Japanese empire into global environmental history. Historically, Japan has had an outsized influence on forests across the Asia Pacific, be it as part of the colonial empire up until 1945, or in more recent decades through industrial logging operations in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. So at one level, this book it sets out to kind of map the full scope of Japan's ecological footprint across the Asia Pacific. It proceeds from the contention that in order to understand the verdancy and conservation of forests at home in Japan, you have to look at its control of landscapes abroad. And it really uses Korea and the Korean Peninsula as a case study to track the transformation of Japan's so-called Green Archipelago, which describes kind of forestry and forest conservation in pre-industrial Japan, into what I call an empire of forestry in the 20th century. Its transformation into the era of industrial capitalism and high imperialism. I develop a number of arguments in the book. Given the forum and its emphasis on approaches to the Japanese empire, I want to flag 3 in particular that I think kind of point to new directions in the field. I notice a number of friends and colleagues among the attendees who are also scholars of Japanese empire, and so I really hope we can maybe use this to open up a broader conversation about kind of new directions and the imperial turn in Japan studies. One of them, quite simply, is to bring environmental forces and material conditions into the foreground of colonial politics and everyday life in Korea. I devote many pages to kind of making sense of the material transformation of the Korean landscape as a result of Japanese settler colonialism, the developmental agenda of the state, wartime mobilization, and the growth of kind of a command economy for natural resources. Historians have paid a kind of passing attention over the last few decades to the material changes wrought by colonial rule. They make note of the rapid development of colonial railways across the Asian continent, for example. They discuss the transformation of cities and the built environment, the growth of settler enclaves. Those projects were not summoned from a thin air. They were born of complex and quite contentious commodity chains that transformed forests and forest resources into kind of the material underpinnings of the developmental agenda of the colonial state. So one of the things I really try to do in this book is to better understand those material underpinnings and how various resources were commandeered and put to use by the colonial state and its different agents, as well as the resistance that inspired. A second set of questions revolves around the nature of state power in colonial Korea. One of the things that has always struck me, and really struck me from the very outset of this research, is how frequently the foresters who populate my account were sent back to their drawing boards. This is not a story of simply imposing their blueprints for modernized forests and woodlands from on high. Their projects inspired resistance, and they often really failed and were forced to regroup at various kind of stages along the way. And so when viewed through the Bureau of Forestry, I think you see a different face of colonial officialdom, one that's more humbled and one that is boxed in by forces that are often beyond its control, be they natural forces, colonial politics, or even internal dissension. The colonial foresters did not speak with one voice. They were often at odds with one another. And I think that presents a different kind of face of state power. If there were any spaces in colonial Korea that were recalcitrant to state control, it was those placed under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Forestry. Slash and burn farmers, Swidden agriculturalists, communist guerrilla bandits, all staged resistance and subversive activities from the highlands of Korea, which comprise 70% of the Korean landscape. And so I also think that viewing the state from the timberline offers an opportunity to gauge the limits of state power. Secondly, or thirdly, rather, the last thing I want to flag for you all is simply that this book is an attempt to look beyond the Korean Peninsula and to situate the Korean Peninsula within an empire-wide framework. The book is first and foremost kind of a case study of the politics of forest conservation in Korea, but it also tries to develop an empire-wide framework. I argue that you can't understand the forestry project in Korea without looking at the making of Manchuria and the flow of natural resources across the Yalu River. Likewise, I show how intellectual and interpersonal networks and bureaucratic institutions formed anchors across the Japanese empire that connected forestry in Karafuto to that in Hokkaido to that in Taiwan. I think traditionally historians of the Japanese empire compartmentalize the empire. They look at one piece and do a careful study of that piece. And I'm trying to suggest that we have a lot to gain when we look more broadly and try to understand the empire as a whole. And I think tracking the flow of natural resources is a productive way to do that. For the sake of time, I'll stop there. There's plenty more to say, but I look forward to your questions and comments.
I can go next, but originally I thought Kelly. Shall I go ahead?
Kelly? No, you're muted.
You're muted, Kelly.
Technically, if we are going west to east, I would be before Sarah.
Right. Yeah, you're next.
I'm next? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So hi, I'm Kelly Hammond. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And I do not have a copy of my book at home with me, but in 2020, I published a book called China's Muslims and Japan's Empire, Centering Islam in World War II with the University of North Carolina Press in their Islamic Civilization and Muslim Networks series. And I think really I'm going to take a similar approach that David took and just sort of provide an overview of some of the arguments and interjections that I was hoping to make with my book. And really the first thing that I was trying to do was to reinstate agency to Muslim actors from China in their decisions to participate in or not participate in Chinese state and nation building projects on the Chinese mainland in the beginning of the 20th century. And so you might be wondering, what does this have to do with the Japanese Empire? And what I argue is that many of the Chinese Muslim reformers were sort of dissatisfied with the options that either the Chinese communists or the Chinese nationalists were presenting them, and looked to other people, such as the Japanese Empire, to be their benefactors and to provide them with, opportunities to reform the state or reform education in ways that they saw more closely aligned with their own particular interests. And so by doing this, by reinstating agency to these Muslim actors, what I was also trying to do was to sort of complicate some of the narratives of wartime collaboration and perhaps add another layer to the conversation. And Rana Mitter, who's here today, has written extensively on collaboration, but oftentimes I found that minority voices were missing from some of these stories, and we look at collaborationist regimes or specific spaces of collaboration. And I really wanted to sort of include Muslim minorities who worked with the Japanese Empire to sort of tell different and new stories about World War II. I also was trying to show the ways that Japanese imperial policy had a tangible outcome or a tangible impact on the ways that both the Chinese nationalists and later the Chinese communists approached the handling of ethnic minorities on the Chinese mainland. And in many cases, the Chinese nationalists were had all kinds of different haphazard plans. And in a number of specific cases that I bring up in my book, they sort of say, wow, look what the Japanese are doing. They're quite successful. Maybe we should try copying some of their policies, especially with regards to education reform. So that was another sort of thing that I was hoping to bring in, and then perhaps show some of the continuities between Japanese imperial policy and later the way that the Chinese communists handled minority issues on the Chinese mainland. The fourth issue that I was sort of really interested in exploring was something similar to David, is sort of like putting the conversation about the Japanese Empire in a sort of larger global perspective. And the way that I looked at doing that was looking at the way that the Japanese Empire was looking to its Axis allies and the way that they were handling Muslim populations under their control. So obviously, specifically the Italians in North Africa, as well as the Italians in North Africa, as well as the Nazis and their sort of alignment with people like the Mufti of Jerusalem or in the Balkans. And the main goal of that was to sort of globalize, really show the sort of global scope and the way that the Japanese Empire really was a sort of had a global reach. And so finally, the last thing that I'm hoping I achieve in this book is by sort of focusing on these Muslim actors from China. I really was interested in showing the ways that not only that the ways that they experienced the Japanese Empire, so how they talked and wrote about Tokyo or their travels to Tokyo, but about how these actors actually often traversed what we would generally consider to be the geographical boundaries of the Japanese Empire and went to places beyond it. So they're going to Afghanistan, they're going to, on Mecca to the Hajj, they're going to North Africa to look for new markets for goods produced in the Japanese Empire. So sort of maybe sort of rethinking some of the ways that we conceptualize Japanese imperial space by looking at actors who go beyond what we would generally consider to be the Japanese imperial, the sort of bounded area of the Japanese empire. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. And with that, I will pass the torch over to Sarah and let her take it from there.
Hi. Thanks, Kelly. So I want to thank Jeff for organizing this incredible event, to Seiji and Alexis for commenting, to the other panelists for joining, and to the audience for coming. I know everybody has a lot of Zoom these days, so thank you for that. I'm Sarah Kovner, and here's my book, Prisoners of the Empire Inside Japanese POW Camps. It came out in the fall of 2020 from Harvard University Press. All right, so my book explores how Japanese prisoner of war camps were administered and what captives experienced. I do that by focusing on specific camps and their commanders in the Philippines, Singapore, Japan, and Korea. And in my book, I argue that there is nothing inherent to Japanese culture or character that led to the inhumane treatment of POWs. The Japanese government and military never made it policy to mistreat, exploit, or abuse their prisoners. In fact, the official policy was to adhere to the Geneva Conventions. But imperial planners never thought through what resources the empire would need to expand, and this created dilemmas for a military unprepared to create adequate logistics or labor. So what this meant is that there was little planning for what became a vast number of POWs. And the Japanese military response was marked by bureaucratic incoherence. And this created a vastly differential experience where contextual factors and variation in camp conditions could result in sometimes horrific experiences. So in my book, I tell the story of people's lives in captivity, POWs, internees, people who lived around the camps, and guards themselves. Some of the people that I mentioned in my book include men like American counterintelligence officer Carl Engelhardt, who is a rare Japanese-speaking prisoner of war. Alan Toews, a lance bombardier in the British Army, who was astonished to find starving Koreans desperate to break into a POW camp. Women like Mary Dorothy Cornelius, who resented the loss of status and the fact that she had to wear a number like a convict, even more than the lack of food. But also, I look at Japanese guards and officers who resist stereotypes like Camp Commander Noguchi Zuru or Korean guards like Pak Byung-suk. And we often hear a cultural experience about the samurai code when we're talking about prisoner of war camps, right? That the Japanese were inhuman. But my book shows they were all too human, and this could have happened anywhere. I think that my work changes how we should think about the Japanese as guards, and as also about the men who spent their warriors in captivity. We need to think more carefully about what being taken a prisoner meant, beyond the suffering, the real suffering that so many people experienced. Captivity is characterized by the absence of combat, which is a marker of manliness and martial valor. What did this do to the Allied POWs who spent their warriors in camps where their bodies shrank, they had tattered clothes, and brooded about everyday humiliations at the hands of Japanese men? So with that, I guess I'm done. And Rana, you're next.
Thanks, Sarah. Very smooth handover. Many thanks for that. And this is my new book, which just came out in September of last year, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. And that's, like Sarah's, from Harvard University Press. The book was written in some ways over a period of 20 years when I was first struck, actually a visit as a postdoctoral researcher to Beijing in the late 1990s. Which I'm horrifyingly told by my students these days is definitely a historical period, even though I can remember it quite clearly myself. So that's worrying. By going to various places, but particularly the museum that many of you on this call, I think, will know, the War of Resistance Museum at Wanping at the Marco Polo Bridge, just outside the center of Beijing, and looking around it and wondering actually why the experience of China's World War II involvement was both little understood, I think, in the wider world, but also seem to have emerged only relatively recently in China itself. That particular museum, I went to see it when it was 10 years old in 1997. The official opening was just 10 years earlier than that in 1987. You do not need me in this audience to tell you that 1987 is a very long time after the end of World War II. The broad contours of some of the story, I think, will be known to you. So I will skip some of what I'd say, A, if I had more time, and B, if I had a less expert audience than I do at the moment. But I think the underlying questions and some of the answers are things that in different forms, many of you will have recognized. The question of war memory is one that is now so well covered, it's almost become a sort of conventional wisdom in the field, not just of Asian studies, but European. And I, like many people amongst you, of course, have over the years read and hugely benefited from the works of Pierre Nora, of Jay Winter, of Paul Fussell, and all of those who made that field on the European side. I've also been, deeply impressed by the level of engagement with these agendas on the Japan studies side. And I'm now going to probably insult half the people in this, on the right-hand side of my Zoom here by not mentioning all of their names, but you know who you are. It struck me as weird, therefore, that the Chinese side of this story, the story of why, actually, like so many other countries, certainly including Britain, whereas I'm sure you know, everything is World War II all the time. Brexit, World War II. COVID, World War II. It's all a massive World War II metaphor where I live at the moment. And yet China's involvement with this has been far less studied and usually only in quite a piecemeal way. So what the book does is to try and integrate an argument with which many may have all sorts of debates and issues they want to put forward, and I'd very much welcome that, to argue that actually, along with lots of things that tend to be more regularly understood as constitutive strands in the collective historical memory of China, or indeed actually what Roger Smith in his wonderful Stories of Peoplehood has called ethically constitutive stories. The Center of Humiliation, of course, being one of those, the Opium Wars, National Humiliation Days, and all of that, or the return to tradition, the return of kind of Confucian flavored ideology in a communist context in the present day, or indeed broader stories which have never gone away about Marxism-Leninism. Sometimes I think we ought not to forget that China is ruled by a communist party for a reason. But that all having been said, it seemed to me that the strand that I thought most important, that was least addressed, was the continuing role of the Second World War and of China's involvement in it, both in terms of the fight, of course, at the domestic level, the war of resistance against Japanese aggression, to use the still favored title in China itself, but also what's more and more in China called the World Anti-Fascist War, which has a very different sort of valency, even if it is referring to exactly the same conflict. And with the limited 2 or 3 minutes I have left, I won't try and go through all of the various case studies that I have in the book, but let me just pull out 2 or 3, slightly randomly almost, to try and show you the range of things that I thought and continue to think are interesting about the way that China, meaning reform era China from the 1980s through to the present day, thinks about when it thinks about World War II. So exhibit number 1, the official stand, you might say. And I think one of the things that to me has been most notable in the last 3 or 4 years, no, more than that slightly, but let's say certainly the last five years or so, under Xi Jinping in particular, is the repeated reference by Xi and by Wang Yi, the foreign minister, and various other people, to the fact that China was not just one of the first, but the first signatory to the United Nations Charter in 1945 at San Francisco, while the war was still raging. And of course, this is part of a wider argument about ownership of the post-1945 world order. It was particularly potent. The reason I said 4 years is, of course, President Trump's time in office was one when the Chinese had a particular interest in essentially stealing the Dean Acheson line and saying it wasn't just the Americans who were present at the creation, we were too, and using this as a basis for a kind of moral ownership of the post-war world by saying that when it comes to American blood and treasure spilt in the Pacific War, fine, we were there earlier, we were there in 1937, not just 1941, and we suffered greatly too. Therefore, we have rights in terms of what comes afterwards. Now, you can pick apart many parts of that argument, and I do, not least the fact that, of course, the government that went to San Francisco was the Kuomintang nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, not the CCP government, although one communist delegate, Dong Bi-woo, was actually present. But it's become a potent narrative in a way that simply was unthinkable in 1972, 73, when Mao was still in power. A couple of other quick ones just from other parts of that spectrum, you might say. One of my favorite ones is an examination of the phenomenon, the community known as the Guofen, the online Kuomintang fans, who are basically kind of weirdo cyber warriors. I suspect they're mostly male, although not all, as I discovered. I suspect they're mostly of a certain age. I suspect most of them are people who think they're underpaid and life is hard and are basically playing with their phones on the Beijing subway as they go home, refighting the Battle of Shanghai and going into kind of long, weird, very geeky debates about which Kuomintang detachment was really responsible for defeating which particular Japanese army. Spoiler alert, just like when people in your own fine country are talking about Confederate statues, they're not really talking about the Civil War, they're talking about the present day. Ditto with the online warriors, who of course are opposed by the rival grouping, the Maofen or Mao fans, who take a very different view. Final one from a very different part of the forest again. One of the, I think, most impressive uses of the combination of modern media and an old story was the recovery by one of China's best-known TV talk show hosts, Cui Yongyuan, of the stories of former World War II veterans on the nationalist side whose stories had never been told because they were politically incorrect. They weren't actually passed originally for showing on national TV on the grounds that it was too politically problematic. But because by the time he was recording the stories of these 80-year-old men in their last days in the age of social media, in that brief window before 2013 when Chinese social media was actually quite free, uploading all of these stories, Wo de Kang Zhan, My War of Resistance, became a huge internet hit, which eventually in a loop round was shown on Chinese TV. It's become part of a much wider movement for the restitution and restoration of justice to former Kuomintang veterans for the loss of their wartime pensions, as well as perhaps even more significantly for their wartime honor. And I'll leave this with one final thought, which brings us back to the subject of the Japanese Empire. Of course, it's the war against Japan that provides the starting point for inevitably the horrific war that lasted 8 years and killed millions of people. But the one conclusion I came to, having looked at all the material and put the book together, is that yes, to some extent, for some people, continued anger against the Japanese is relevant and important, and it's one of the things that people tend to assume this is about. But the vast majority of the phenomenon, I think, is not about that at all. I think it's about Chinese people talking to other Chinese people about China today, and why even in the midst of national revival, consumerist paradise, strong national confidence to the level of arrogance, there's something in the middle missing. Doesn't seem quite to be there, something empty. And for at least some of those people from very different walks of life, World War II seems to have provided some kind of narrative to fill it. Whether it's going to succeed in doing that, I can't say. But I think once you look for the evidence, there's a tremendous amount of it there. Okay, thanks, Jeff. I'll pass back to you. Is that the way to go? Thank you.
Yes, great. So this is wonderful. We've got the 4 books on the table, very much as I was hoping we would. I'll just interject one thing about, I'm always interested if when something about an event like this links up to events in the news on this exact day. And this is the day when the virtual version of Davos is taking place. And Xi Jinping has just spoken there and made an emphasis on the need for the world to safeguard the international system centered around the UN and the international order based on international law. So it's playing exactly that card that as one of the key arguments in Rana's book about this use of the wartime experience to try to situate China, even at moments when it's violating parts of the UN, but it's always been part of the UN story that people who talk about safeguarding the UN are violating ideals of it. Without further interjections, but I just like that idea of both including Japan, but bringing in both Korea and China to the discussion. We now have Seiji Shirane, who will have a book out relevant to the Japanese Empire in the future. And then he'll hand it off to Alexis Dudden, who has, I think, one of the first books I read about the Japanese Empire to do that. So on to you, too.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So I'm Seiji Shirani, Assistant Professor of History at the City College of New York. And as Jeff just mentioned, I have a forthcoming book from Cornell University Press set for 2022 titled Imperial Gateway, Colonial Taiwan and Japanese Expansion in South China and Southeast Asia from 1895 to 1945. And it's in direct dialogue with the books we're discussing today. So I'm very thankful for this opportunity for Jeff and the panelists for inviting me today. So I wanted to start by going back to the year 2000. Everyone knows Andre Schmidt's Journal of Asian Studies article that was very critical of studies of Japan's empire that were very Tokyo, Japanese language centered. A lot of the works looking from Tokyo outwards to the colonies and sort of separating domestic and foreign history. And really, you know, the books today show how far we've come in 2 decades. The multilingual source archives highlight really the diverse range of perspectives beyond Tokyo, beyond the Japanese, and in China's case, with Rana's case, beyond even the ROC or PRC capitals. In addition, as David said, they really address comparative cases both within the empire, but even beyond East Asia that will really speak to non-area studies audiences. So with David, it's the Western imperial greenification regimes. How's his case study different and similar? With Kelly, both the comparisons and the connections with Nazi Italian Muslim policies. With Sarah, she has some great episodes on talking about comparisons with German POW policies towards Soviet Union POWs, how the mortality rate was much higher in those cases. And then the post-war, you know, hypocritical activities by the US towards Japanese captives after all the complaining they did about putting Allied POWs to work. They did pretty much the same thing to Japanese captives, including non-Japanese, Taiwanese, Korean prison guards. And then with Rana, he in his introduction really puts forth this idea that the post-war Sengo for Japan, post-war US, post-war Britain are very sort of established, you know, historiographical and narrative frameworks. Whereas in China, you know, it's much more complicated. We talk about a Cold War China, but you know, perhaps a post-war framework for China will really bring us further in terms of thinking about China's nationalistic historiography and historiography on World War II. So just a couple comments and questions. I wanted to talk about how the books, as Kelly said, really foreground the importance of geographic, spatial, and also ethno-racial variables in Japan's empire. So the importance of regional local cases, they really illustrate the tremendous diversity within Japan's empire. We're no longer really talking about a Japanese model or you know, homogeneous case. With Kelly, it's in North China, but in fact, it even starts with the sort of Manchukuo model of how to deal with Muslims, and then going from Manchukuo to North China, later Southeast Asia, the rest of, you know, Central, Middle East, Africa, etc. Just a side note, I was, you know, wondering if Kelly could talk more about the first Manchukuo sort of model for Muslims and Sino-Muslims and how it was exported or differed from the North China model. For David, you know, he talks about Korea and goes into the environmental material characteristics and how the Japanese adopted Western foreign techniques, not only within Japan's home islands, but then into new environmental conditions in Korea. And he gives us great comparative detail on the differences with Taiwan, Hokkaido, Karafuto, etc. And then with Sarah's case studies, looking at Singapore, Philippines, Korea, Japan, and seeing how there's no one typical POW camp. And then also looking at the diversity, commonality among captive experiences. And then even with Rana's book, not just looking at Beijing, but looking at regional narratives from Chongqing, Yan'an, Henan, and basically looking at the limits of Beijing nationalistic narratives and also competing narratives in the public sphere. Right, as much as we're talking about the limits of Japanese state power, in many ways there's limits in Chinese state power as well. Secondly, you know, by highlighting the centrality of ethno-racial identities, especially in Kelly, David, and Sarah's works, we look at how diversity of on-the-ground experiences really are exemplified by hierarchies within and differences between Han collaborators, Sino-Muslims, Koreans as second-class subjects, Taiwanese guards as second-class subjects. You also have British Indians, Asian captives, and then really, even though there's so much emphasis placed on allied Western POWs, in many ways, non-Western Asian captives suffered much more. Of course, in China, there are no real Geneva POW convention policies put in place because they're not at war. So from 37 to 41, you have way more atrocities that are usually underplayed. And so by focusing on local, regional, ethno-racial factors, these books highlight the limits of Japan's state power, as David said. And as Sarah says, there's no master plan in Tokyo, no monolithic Japanese state. Instead, as David shows, experiments, failures, competition between Korean forced bureaucrats and then Manchurian officials. And then how all these policies are closely intertwined with the agency, the self-interest of local non-Japanese actors. All the while trying to humanize the Japanese. They're not all ribbon goids or devils, right? So of course, everyone's saying we're not trying to sort of defend Japanese empire, but at least to put a human face. So one question is that all four of these books really touch on the topic of Chinese-Korean collaboration. Kelly talking about how Sino-Muslim collaboration is different from Han collaboration. I was wondering more about, are there differences or similarities with Mongol, Manchu, Tibetan collaboration vis-a-vis Japan? David looks at very convincing cases of Korean scholars, bureaucrats, laborers involved in forced production, Sarah with the Korean prison guards, and then Rana with this notion that, at least within the PRC, it's still a very taboo subject and one that is more highlighted in the Anglophone field that started, of course, with his 2000 book, Timothy Brooks' book since then. And we've really gone far in terms of trying to go beyond resistance, collaboration binaries. And I think all four are trying to remove the morality or moral sort of evaluation from collaboration, to borrow Sarah's phrase, to take the morality play out of it. Yet, all four books use the term collaboration, and we really haven't sort of come up with an alternative word, 合作 or 協力, sort of seem to me more neutral terms in Chinese and Japanese. So are there any thoughts within, among the panelists on the future of collaboration, the term, rhetoric, frameworks? And then lastly, how do you think scholarly and then even public audiences will react to your books? Hopefully they'll be read in English. I imagine many of them will be translated into Chinese, Korean, or Japanese. And of course, we're aimed at a more Anglophone audience, but Korea or Japan. So those are my comments, and thank you very much.
Jeff, you want me to talk?
Yeah, on to you,
Okay.
Alexis. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I will try to be very quick. First of all, Jeff, thank you for hosting this. Thank the four of you for writing tremendously interesting books. Kelly, I have a copy of your book if you need me to mail it to you. That's the fun part. So it's great. These are really, this is the good part of COVID, right? I'm home, I'm reading. And Seiji, I can't wait for your book. Full disclosure, I met Seiji Shirane before Hirohito died. So Rana, if you want to play who's older in the room, it's pretty unusual.
You killed him together?
No, it just shows how old I am and how much Seiji has come, into a totally different period of his life. And I can't wait for his book in particular. All of these are excellent. And Jeff, you and I need to be applying for a grant so that we can teach a graduate class with all of these books, please, with Seiji's. And I'm going to begin just a quick moment of memoriam. Two towering figures in the Japan field, very different scholars, have died within a month of one another. Es Vogel Tetznajita. And, this is a pretty unusual historical moment when you get two men who defined very different Japans, but it ties into what Seiji is saying, and I'll try to make that work. They each, in their own ways, premised the importance of seeing the world through Japanese eyes, which is impossible. We know that on the one hand. On the other hand, each of them really wanted to premise seeing the world out, not what was refracted through being the imperialist, which falls into being American or British in this vector. And so I think if I could just begin with what Seiji just lucidly said and Sarah raised it too, we're not trying to defend the Japanese empire as such on the one hand. On the other hand, it was an enormous accomplishment of human activity. It came at the cost of tens of millions of lives and devastated environments, economies, and lives. And yet to do this today, as we've each been saying, and Rana perhaps most explicitly so, comes in the present tense, which means you're either pro or anti-Japanese, or you're pro or anti-Chinese. And Seiji just mentioned the terms in Chinese and Japanese, and David will back me up. There's still not a good term for collaborate. It's close to Japan, Chinilpa. And when you think about contemporary Korean history, a divided nation, what does that mean, right? You've got South and North Korean. What does it matter who's collaborating with Japan? So that's today, and we're all wading through this. And I guess my one overarching, it's not a criticism, it's a suggestion for all of us. And very few of us are equipped to do this. And Jeff, when you and I host this graduate seminar, we need to include more of Andrew Barchet and Yukiko Koshiro's work on the Soviet ending of this. Because what Rana taught me several years ago that I repeat over and over, right, of course the United States wasn't going to win the war without China. But we are all boxed into this bomb that falls out of the sky that ends the war, but we consistently don't include enough. And I'm first and foremost. So I'm just putting that out there that all of us need to add Soviet into this. I'll be really quick because we've got tons of questions, and I've got just basically a question comment for each of you. David, I have my invasive plant species over my shoulder to discuss. Poinsettia does not grow in my zone 6, let alone my longitude, but I'm a gardener, so I love your project. I'm also from Pennsylvania. The derivation means Penn's Woods, and my only suggestion as you go forward and talk empire is start very much in the United States. Insofar as, the initial agricultural colleges, the whole reason Hokkaido gets planted, the development of Nitobei Inazo's thought is a combination of weird Quakerisms about planting the people, but also you brought up the issue of war. I grew up surrounded in suburban Philadelphia by pin oak trees, which were specifically grown for masts of ships. And in addition to spreading through the empire, Seiji's got great stuff in his book, Going South, but really also start in the US, start in New England. And it's not a criticism, it's where you take this to broaden the empire. I'm just gonna go to Kelly, for whom I learned so much. Thank you. And I guess I've long been fascinated with Prince Otani's missions to Afghanistan. I'm being really specific in my questions here because Seiji gave the overarching, and particularly because the early, and Ogama Eiji gets into this, Stefan Tanaka gets into this in their work, but the notion of a sort of romantic Orientalism, the recursiveness of the direction of the Silk Road, in which I don't want to call them the early imperialists because they weren't thinking of themselves the way Nitobei was, but this notion that true civilization had come from Persia and landed in Nara, and that ancient Silk Road, and someday after COVID, when the shrine guards allow you into the repository and Nara to see all of the 8th century, 7th century stuff that walked across Asia, that then would get flipped around so that the Romantic imperialists could justify their return to the continent. And they have to incorporate the Persians. And that's what gets really, really tricky because, and David can back me up, if you haven't been to Gyeongju in Korea yet, I hope you have, but there are these statues of the first mathematicians in Korea. And they're from the 8th century. And so the Japanese pick up on this, and I just want you to push your next project. I'd love to hear where your next book is going. I just simply learned so much from this. I want to hear where you're going into taking the Silk Road in different directions. Sarah, this is great. And I think, you have so much in this that is analytically really powerful and important. As you are aware, this is a hot political issue between the US and Japan, particularly the erasure of POWs. And Rana, you guys should give a panel together, because one of the things that has always fascinated me is the different ways POW memory has played out in post-war Britain and post-war US. And Sarah, I wonder, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, I wonder if you've thought I really don't, but specifically because President Obama hugged the Japanese atomic bomb survivor who had spent his life in 2015, when he hugged that man in Hiroshima, that was the man who had spent his life trying to get Americans to learn about the American POWs who'd been bombed in Hiroshima. And I just wonder if the bomb memory plays in any way for your POWs outside of Japan. And if it doesn't, that's fine too. But this notion that those bombs ended, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, POWs are going to get swept under the rug. I just wonder if that plays, or if that's something you wanted to elaborate, because it's a great book. Rana, obviously, this is just magisterial, wouldn't expect anything less. But so the front page of the New York Times today tells me that China has supplanted the United States as a place of foreign direct investment. So we're toast, it's over, China wins. And we all know that. No, I'm just joking. But that's also part of like, okay, we're all prepared for, at some point in our lifetimes, for sure our children's, if we have them lifetimes, we're going to be eclipsed by the Chinese economy. So obviously, we being the United States, sorry. So obviously that's fueling the desire in very different ways. And I brought just one show and tell, because what you're doing for China, Akiko Hashimoto does equally beautifully in Japanese discussions of resuscitating the narrative of loss or pain into valor. So I'm really interested. Jeff and I have discussed the weaponization of history in the East China Sea. And one thing that I'm noticing in that 2013-14 moment is how the CCP nationalizes itself, right? I mean, it's an incredible shift. And, you know, you've got, as you just point out, you've got a communist party running the country that is defining itself through nationalist narratives. It's got an internationalizing economy. And as you and David Kang are saying, and Jeff has just alluded to, you know, they're playing more by the Westphalian rules, certainly, than the United States is. So with that, I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the nationalization of the CCP through these historical narratives. And again, thank you all so much for giving me such good reading during the pandemic.
Wonderful, wonderful. And those are bravura comments. And we could easily spend a lot of time just with responses to those. But what I want to do instead is, we have, in a sense, a third discussant who I didn't realize we would have, in David Gundry of Davis, who began by asking a question of each of the panelists. And I want to read off a version of those. And then I want to invite each of the panelists to not try to engage with everything, but pick a shot. Don't throw away your shot. You can choose one thing that you want to elaborate on or dive in. But first, David Gundry's comments for Sarah, he wanted to know how your book related to Situate Itself compared to John Dower's a magisterial work. And he mentioned in particular that there's a reference there to humane treatment of Russian POWs by their Japanese captors during the Russo-Japanese War, and as a model of sort of going against the grain of the cultural reductionism you were pushing back against. With David, it's a very specific question, whether the proliferation of the cryptomeria and its allergenic pollen play a role in your narrative. And for Kelly, was wondering about religious, ethnic, and regional divisions within China, whether they were exploited by the Japanese invaders and occupiers, thinking about the role of ethnic divisions in Manchuria being used. And there were other questions that came in that asked you to look beyond the Hui, which are your main focus, Hui Muslims, to think about Muslims in Xinjiang, but also think about Tibetans. And is this kind of a larger story, as in some ways it clearly is, of the Japanese Empire and non-Han Chinese? And for non-Han within what's now the People's Republic of China. And then for Rana, the question was whether the PRC government and in Taiwan, the Kuomintang have used Japan's horrific history of mass killing of Chinese people to distract from their own history of mass killing of Chinese people. There are more questions to bring in there, but I think let's go around and let's go in reverse order. Start with Rana, then Sarah, then Kelly, then David, and just pick one of these angles as an entry point and assume that all of them will be things on your mind. Okay, Rana?
Thank you, Jeff. And if I may start actually by first of all thanking Seiji and thanking Alexis for incredibly detailed, thoughtful and nuanced comments, as I would expect, but was very, very, very pleased to receive, because it's plenty food for thought for me and for others in this exercise. Very grateful. And of course to I should have said before, to Jeff for organizing such a wonderful event. But I'm going to take your advice and just hone in on one point, I think, if I may, to keep it lean and mean. And I will pick up on David's really interesting question. And I'm going to answer it in a sort of 90-degree angle, because yes, there is a sense, I think, at which revival of collective memory of horrors like the Nanjing Massacre is very obviously designed to try and create a discourse that distracts, in a sense, from China's own record. But that can also be subverted. And the one example I'd give, and I thought it was one that was extremely interesting that it was possible, is to do with mass deaths rather than mass killings, perhaps I'll put it that way, because it was through a supposedly natural event that actually was a product of war, and that was the Henan famine of 1942, which killed about 4 million people. This was an event that had essentially not been talked about in Mao's China in any kind of meaningful way, but then memory of it was revived through local historians, some of whom I discuss in the book, including one called Song Zhixin. And Feng Xiaogang, big name Chinese director, makes this huge movie, very, very successful about it, released on the 60th anniversary of the famine in 2012. So far, so good. But it didn't take very long for various people, including within China itself, including some of the more spiky figures on a Chinese Weibo environment, which at that point still had spiky figures on it, mostly then got cleaned off after about 2013, who pointed out that much of the dialogue in this film about the Kuomintang caused wartime famine in 1942, such as, my God, it's terrible, the government is taking all the grain and the peasants are starving to death, could be read equally strongly as an indictment of a rather more tricksy famine, the Great Leap Forward famine of the mid-1950s, which of course cannot be addressed in any meaningful, straight-on way in the Chinese environment. And this became a source of some consternation to the authorities, but again, a sign that interesting subversive things could be done. Certainly then, whether it could be done now, I think is a much more moot point, although we could address that another way. The point that I want to make and leave this with, though, is that a lot of deaths, horrific deaths, were involved in that famine, but that particular spat, that particular debate, that particular use of collective memory, actually the Japanese are really quite marginal. I mean, yes, they are the ultimate cause of the situation that gives rise to the famine, but this is really still about working through not only communist versus nationalist Chinese spats, more than spats, really kind of, major conflicts, but also in this particular case of finding a way of today's Chinese, what do we call it, sort of artistic, it's not quite dissident community, but certainly communities who want to tell an alternative history which goes against that which Beijing sends down, against the desire of the state to control it. And as I was saying at the beginning, these are all very much intra-Chinese conversations. The Japanese provide the historical occasion, but they are not actually the primary target in these cases.
Thank you to Alexis and Seiji for your comments, and to David for his question. I'll start with the question. So thanks for bringing this up. I'll just kind of speak about the Russo-Japanese War briefly. And I mean, this is just to say that really it's World War II treatment of POWs by the Japanese that's the anomaly here, because the Japanese prisoners were famous for their treatment of POWs during the Russo-Japanese War and also during World War I. And we know about this because they were really interested in publicizing it, and foreign visitors went to Japan and told all about this. Doctors, there's lots of archival sources on this. The reason is that during the early part of the 20th century, Japan seeking to follow international law to demonstrate the extent to which they're, quote, civilized and cultured country. But by the time World War II rolls around, comes in, there are a number of changes. I write about this a lot in my book, but kind of briefly, there are changes in warfare, and we can talk more about that later. Then there's also the publicization institution of the way of the samurai, and I can again talk more about that. But also, Japan is less interested in playing in this, showing off how great it is to the West and the world. And by 1933, they're announcing their withdrawal from the League of Nations. So that's all I'll say about that. And in terms of the broader questions raised by Alexis and Shirane, or comments really, I'm going to focus on the question of about audience, right? How my work has been received. It's actually surprised me a little bit. I think it's quite true, as Jeff mentioned, that people in different countries have varying degrees of interest in the topic of Allied POWs. It's not just the UK, but also Australia, where we find audiences who are really, really interested in Allied POWs. There are real reasons for this, historical reasons. More Australians died in captivity, right, than in fighting. And in something, it really depends how you count, but twice as many British were held captive than Americans, right? And so there are reasons for that, but also, and I can just tell you from my own experience, I've been invited to do a lot in the UK on this book. I've been invited in the US too, but podcasts, things like this, there are podcasts that are really devoted to this kind of thing. And as for the book's reception, I've been kind of, I guess, not really worried, but there are a number of different audiences that I'm speaking to. The people who survived or whose relatives survived captivity, I think it has to be said that these people, this is affecting my book, or the way that we talk about prisoner of war experiences, captivity experiences, affects these people differently. And I've been lucky enough to talk to a couple of audiences, but that is a different kind of experience, and and I try and acknowledge that when I can. So yeah, I mean, I guess like all of us who are presenting books or have published books in 2020, that experience has been a little bit different than what we expected going in. I think that with the 75th anniversary of, I think that was eclipsed by the tremendous events that were happening in the world that we all know about. So I'll leave it at there so that other people have an opportunity to speak.
Yes. Thank you again. Yes, I also want to reiterate thank you to Seiji and Alexis for your pointed and thoughtful comments. And Seiji, I think I remembered we were talking before where we saw each other last, and I'm pretty sure it was in Paris. It just came to me, so I just had to think about that. So I'm going to try to loop together the question by David and then tie it into a question that Seiji asked. And so David's question is, what are the ways that Japan exploited the divisions between sort of different people living in China's borderlands, and what were the role of Sino-Muslims in this? And I think we need to take into consideration that there were many different actors with many different agendas in China's borderlands in the 1930s and 1940s. One of those being the Soviets, who definitely were able to sort of have an impact and give money and aid, especially to sort of Uyghur communities or Muslims living out in Western China. There was the Japanese. Some Chinese Muslims supported the Chinese communists, and others, people like Bai Tongxi, were like longtime supporters of the Chinese nationalists. So we have a lot of people with different interests. And I think that the Japanese Empire understood some of the tensions on the ground and was able to exploit and use these, in some cases, to their advantage. But I do also think that there is a difference between Sino-Muslims in particular, or Chinese Muslims, from people like Tibetans or Mongols or other minorities, because I think the Japanese Empire very quickly realized their utility beyond the Japanese Empire and the way that they could sort of mobilize these people to help them create relationships with people that they were looking to beyond sort of the milieu that they were operating in. So sending envoys, Muslim envoys to North Africa and parts of the Middle East in order to try to create diplomatic relationships with people like the Saudis, for instance. In 1938, the Japanese Empire sent a number of Chinese Muslims on a Hajj that they sponsored. And one of the outcomes of that was one of the sort of first diplomatic missions of Japanese officials to Saudi Arabia as an effort to try to secure an oil concession. So I think that there was like an understanding of their value as a little bit different than some of the other minorities that lived within the borders of China. And also, because Tibetans are Buddhist and Mongols for the most part were Buddhist, I think that the Japanese Empire needed to work harder to explain who Muslims were to people living on the Japanese home islands. And many people did not, there were very few Muslims in Japan. And so sort of making these people legible took more work than explaining what a Mongolian Buddhist would have been. And so I think that there were similarities in their approaches to managing different minorities, but I think with Muslims there were specifically a number of differences. And just to quickly get to Alexis's point about my next project, I'm sort of bringing this into the Cold War, and my next project is called Islam and Politics in the East Asian Cold War, where I'm going to look at the ways that post-occupation Japan, nationalist Taiwan, and the PRC handled its relationships with new post-colonial Muslim states in a sort of diplomatic maneuvering. So thank you for the questions.
Well, just to quickly answer Professor Gundry's question about Sugi, the answer is yes, it does figure into my narrative only insofar as I talk about the changing structures of the global and trans-Pacific timber marketplace that facilitates Japan's dependency on gaizai, the importation of timber from abroad, which in turn leads to the proliferation of these monocultures. And there's a fascinating history to be written about them in their own right. That's not central to my own project, but it is inextricably linked to Japan's incursions into the forests of Southeast Asia and their dependency on importing forest resources from beyond the archipelago. I want to take on the larger question of collaboration. It's something that figures into all of our projects. And I think in my book, I develop a somewhat unusual approach to the topic in the sense that I am looking at a narrower form of collaboration that is scientific collaboration. I have a specific chapter devoted entirely to kind of the inner workings of the forest experiment stations that tracks the careers of individual scientists, both Japanese and Korean, to try to understand kind of the politics and interpersonal relations that shaped the research agenda of the colonial state. And so while I completely recognize how frustrating the vocabulary of collaboration can be, I also think that we have a lot to gain when we kind of take these deeper dives and look and focus at the collaboration between smaller groups of individuals or smaller institutions. Here, my own approach is informed in part by Yumi Moon's work on populist collaborators in colonial Korea. I think we have, it's quite beneficial when we can kind of sink our teeth into a smaller sample or smaller community to better understand the power dynamics that are at work. And in my case, I sort of track these odd bird scientists, botanists, forest ecologists, who some Japanese, some Korean, who really need each other. It's a story of codependency. They forge very lasting innovations in colonial science, in forest science, some of which reverberate across the empire. But their insights into what to plant, where, and how would not have been possible without the transculturation of knowledge, without Korean research assistants kind of unlocking the keys, the doors to specimen, translating key scientific treatises from Korean to Japanese. And likewise, it speaks to an open-mindedness on the part of Japanese scientists who were willing to take seriously the traditional practices of agrarian communities, for example. So I suppose my larger point is that when we're talking about collaboration, perhaps it makes sense to create kind of more bounded, more context and specific cases that allow us to appreciate the multiple forms of collaboration that took shape within the broader context of colonial power dynamics. I will stop there. I know we have a growing list of questions. So Jeff, I don't know how you want to approach that.
Yeah, okay, I will. Well, I was going to just jump in and say, Alexis, I can't wait to teach that class with you. But I think actually, and this goes to one of the questions that was brought up, that the theorizing about empire has largely still carries over things from theorizing that was done about the 19th century with the British and the French empires and areas like that, seen as the kind of model. So we might think about something of just kind of late coming empires that to some extent or another tried to pretend that they weren't empires. Teaching right now teaching a course on the world in 1900 and using How to Hide an Empire, a wonderful book about the efforts by America to pretend it didn't have an empire. And Japan, at certain points, pretended that parts of what it was doing wasn't. And China right now, I think, in similar ways. And the issue of collaboration comes up now. Do we call Carrie Lam a collaborator, for example, in Hong Kong? But this comes to a question that Ed Pulford from the UK asked. And he was saying he wondered how fresh approaches to the Japanese empire may help inform conversations around decolonization in the academy and beyond, particularly in the context of contemporary American and Chinese empire in East Asia, how to disentangle anti-imperial historical grievances. For example, today, China thinking about Xinjiang, Tibet, and elsewhere. And I think that's a very kind of broad question. So I think to bring that in, and also I think we have a possibility here since Alexis flagged the fact that the Soviet side of this, another perhaps late empire to think about, hasn't been addressed really in these books. Tanya Linkova is in the audience, and we will try to allow her to weigh in if she wants to provide, since she's written so importantly on the Soviet Japanese empire side. And I think technically we can, technologically, we can have her come in. But I thought if we first see which of you would like to respond, any of you, to Ed's question about the sort of way in which the discussions of the Japanese empire might relate to these broader debates on decolonization and empire. So who'd like to go? We can we don't have to go with this one by one strategy now. So anybody want to hold up their hand who wants to go next? Okay, Rana.
Well, just a brief note to say that I think that one of the reasons that we don't talk about the deconstruction of the Japanese empire in the way that we perhaps do the deconstruction of the British and French empires, although having said that, there is, I think, more work emerging in the Japan field that actually does engage with this more explicitly within the last 5 to 7 years, something like that. But one of the reasons, as with so much else, is the way in which the circumstances of the early Cold War really very rapidly changed the political atmosphere in which the discussion could be had. And I think it's really, I speak, party pre here because of my kind of growing obsessive interest with the very, very early post-1945 years. But the level of engagement between a newly rising Kuomintang China, which thought, at least for a couple of years under Chiang Kai-shek, it was going to be a power broker in the region, and the way that it, as Barack Kushner has shown in his magnificent book, Men to Devils, Devils to Men, that it tries not only, of course, to get a certain type of transitional justice at that stage, but also clearly opens up all sorts of, frankly, at times rather embarrassing links with figures, not least General Okamura is one who comes to mind, in terms of trying to construct what essentially is a sort of post-colonial idea of East Asia in which the Japanese are going to be essentially in a hierarchically lower position because they've been defeated, but can be used as part of a newly emerging Chinese nationalist discourse of Asian solidarity and post-imperialism. And you can see Chiang Kai-shek and his government setting themselves up as the great kind of colonial liberators to be in this area. They have a lot of time also debating about what role they should or shouldn't play in colonial Vietnam at this stage as well. Of course, we now know that the circumstances from 1947 at least onwards mean that this becomes a sort of fantasy pipe dream. But during much of that time, there is, I think, a really quite explicit belief that actually engaging with the fragments of a suddenly disappeared Japanese empire and turning it towards Chinese ends while existing within this American-oriented new vision of Asia is a realistic political project. And for a very short time, at least conceptually and structurally, it clearly is.
I'll jump in one more thing from another question here, because that relates, I think, to some extent to this. Alex Saros asked David, to what extent, if you go into the idea that Japanese forestry in Korea provided a model for a developmental structure for the rest of the Japanese empire, these efforts provide a model for the Pan-Asian co-prosperity narrative. And that would be another narrative that I'd say, when I see Belt and Road discussions, when I see a lot of discussions about China, an immediate thought for me is how both the historical Silk Road is being invoked, but there are also carryovers from what's not being invoked of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, but that isn't something that's on the kind of the immediate go-to place in the global imagination in the way that the Marshall Plan is. And so there's this disparity between the degree of kind of circulating knowledge about that. But that would be the kind of thing that I guess, but perhaps specifically there, was this part of was the Korea example with forestry a first test egg that then was applied other places?
So I think there's two quick points to be made. One is that the greenification initiatives in colonial Korea actually were carefully studied by Japanese foresters back in the archipelago over the course of the 1930s, and especially as they began to kind of ramp up for wartime, in part because they felt that their counterparts in Korea had honed these really sophisticated mechanisms for using forestry and especially silviculture as a form of social control. And that was a new exigency of wartime natural resource management. So kind of ironically, these colonial territories, which are supposed to have been denuded and backwards in their conservationist practices, decades later go on to inform the greenification of the metropole itself. The other point that I would make is that here we really ought to appreciate the full geographical and ecological scope of the empire itself, which stretches from the northern reaches of the Manchurian taiga all the way down to Indonesia, across the Pacific Rim. So one of the things that's most impressive to me is actually how kind of decentralized. This natural resource management and forestry in particular is in the Japanese empire. To their credit, Japanese foresters recognize that what happens in one part of the empire by dint of geography is not going to work elsewhere. And they are very, very much attuned to and sensitive to the material conditions they find in each and every colonial territory that comes under Japanese control. So it's not so much a top-down kind of exporting models as much as it is studying and responding to the landscape itself, which is why these forest experiment stations are so important. They allow the Japanese state or different entities to better understand where they're doing their work before they cement policy, but they also facilitate empire-wide networks of intellectual exchange. So I see those as being particularly important kind of anchors in the empire of forestry that spans the entire empire.
Okay, we've got, since you mentioned Indonesia, the reach there, and that's a place we haven't brought in, there's a question from Ethan Mark in the Netherlands. It says that in Indonesia, the Japanese purposely sought to work with Muslims for one reason, out of the idea they were politically safe, not leftist, kind of shadows of the US in the Cold War, including training to paramilitaries. And he was wondering if there was a similar policy on similar grounds in Occupy China. And after that, so if Kelly, if you could respond specifically to that. And there also have been a couple of questions just asking to bring Xinjiang a bit more into the discussion. And I know that's your a place you feel comfortable talking about. And then if Tatiana, if you're okay, I'd like to bring you in to say, in part, a kind of, if you can, off comment, like what would have been different if one of the books had been about the Soviet Union and that, if you're comfortable with that. But first you, Kelly.
Yes, thanks to Ethan Mark for the question. And I think that it was definitely a little bit of a concern, and they, when they were recruiting Sino-Muslims, especially in urban places like Beijing, there was a concerted effort to sort of try to recruit ones that were Sino-Muslims who were specifically anti-communist. And the protagonist in my third chapter, Tang Yichen, he'd been known in in Beijing for a long time before the Japanese arrived as being a sort of anti-communist agitator. Whether or not the policy was sort of as direct as it was in Indonesia, because the Chinese communists at this time were really sort of centered in certain places, and they had their own issues with Muslims in China. Number one, running land reform campaigns was very unpopular among Muslim populations in North China. And so they were sort of reconciling some of these issues with the Chinese communists were trying to sort of reconcile some of these issues with how to handle Muslim populations. And so I don't know if it was as an important an issue as it later became, as you and other people have shown in your work in Indonesia. And to sometimes people want to make these sort of parallels to sort of things that are happening now in Xinjiang. I am kind of careful about doing that, but I would say, I think that one of the places, we always have this idea, and I think it's starting to be questioned, that the CCP's national minorities policy is a sort of rubber stamp of the Soviet model. And I think by looking at what I call sort of like Japanese successes in the 1940s, we can really sort of look for roots in some of these minority policies in some of the things that the Japanese empire was doing in the 1940s, and the sort of ways that the communists observed and learned from them. So I don't know if that fully satiates everyone's desire to hear about Xinjiang, but I am sometimes cautious about sort of the historical analogies with Xinjiang. And I see Tatiana's here.
Yes, Tatiana, thanks so much for agreeing to chime in. Kelly noticed you in the audience. I thought this is too good an opportunity. So it's like a special guest coming on at the end of the concert. So Please introduce
Well,
yourself.
thank you.
And introduce yourself and your book. Yeah, yeah.
All right, so I'm Tatiana Linhoeva. I'm an assistant professor of Japanese history at New York University, and I also published a book last year, and it's called Revolution Goes East, Imperial Japan and Soviet Communism. And this is precisely about what Alexis Dadan was talking about, right? Bringing the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire into the East Asian field, not only Japanese field, but East Asia. And so thank you, Alexis, for bringing this up. And incidentally, Andrew Barshay was my advisor at credit school. So I know a lot about this book because I was sort of his research assistant. So I learned a lot about the POWs in the Soviet Union. So I try to do in my book and in my scholarship exactly that, to look at the Japanese empire through its relationship with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was an empire, a hidden empire, right? And what Jeffrey, you were saying, and the empires that refuses to be called as such. But it's interesting, North China, in Outer Mongolia, were so important for the Japanese empire in the 1920s and 1930s. And I thought we kind of forget about it. We all talk about, the United States as the British Empire, but the Russians and the Soviets, later the communists, I argue, of course, it's my position, but I argue maybe were the priority for the Japanese during the interwar period, and they formulated their policies thinking about, what would be the next move of the Russians, how they can, whether they can push against the Russians, whether they have to accommodate and collaborate, and yeah. So that's how I look at Eastern Eurasia, and where the two empires, this very long relationship of for 200-300 years, and how they are trying to manage all the space and the people. And yeah, so I'm looking forward. I'm reading Kelly's book now, and if what Jeffrey, you asked me if how we can what kind of scholarship we can do bringing the Soviets into this whole picture. Yes, there's the Japanese ethnic policies and their how China and the Soviet nationality policies kind of played in all this picture. And the other thing is, sorry, my son is just got in.
No, that was an impossible way to be put on the spot there. But if you wanted to join back in, please
Yeah,
do.
yeah, but yeah, I think yes, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what this suggests is a kind of multi-empire period in history in which there's a lot of watching back and forth. And I think Tatiana's work alerts us to the fact of the need to be mindful of all the different directions in which different states were looking both for competition, but also for playbooks to use from, and that both of that comes in there. And there was, and I think maybe this is a good final question to end because it's very broad. Sami Sadikwi, if I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, says that I'm wondering whether the authors can talk about how literature on European empires have impacted the historiography on the Japanese empire recently. I'm thinking of the recent edited volume on affect and empire, for instance. I was also wondering whether there was a frustration in the Japanese empire not being included in conversations on comparative empires. I'm thinking here of the forthcoming Cambridge volumes, for instance. And says, apologies, I know these are very broad issues, but I think maybe that's a good place to end this, is simply that in part, I think this is something to suggest that there's a lot to be gained by bringing the study of the Japanese empire into this broader discussion of empires in general. But of course, one challenge is that it's not, I can't tell everybody who tuned in, but most of the people who tuned in are not going to be, are disproportionately people who are already interested in East Asia or the East Asian empires. So I guess maybe an ending thought would be sort of what is there as a takeaway from your book? We'll go back to the authors that you kind of wish your non-East Asian colleagues, if they could take one thing away from your book, what would you hope that might be? And then we'll use this as a way to wrap it up. So let's start with David, Kelly, Sarah, and Rana in that order.
I suppose mine would be that green imperialism comes in many shades of green, which is to say that there's this incredibly rich body of scholarship on green imperialism, sort of looking at the relationship between territorial expansion and conservationist thought and discourse. It is a thoroughly Eurocentric literature. And I am offering up the Japanese Empire as sort of an alternative trajectory and tradition of forest management, one that spans the Asia Pacific and ought to be something that they take seriously in thinking about scientific forestry, not just as this monolithic static set of practices, but as something that is in kind of responding to different landscapes and geographies and peoples and politics in different regions of the globe.
I'm just happy when my colleagues realize that there are Muslims in China, and so that's like one big takeaway that I'm always excited that I sort of let people know that they're an important voice. But I think sort of riffing off what a lot of other people say, there's the idea that Japan is a sort of egregious outlier in sort of imperial studies, and it does things on its own way. And I think it's very important to sort of continue to put it in conversation with other non-Western imperial projects like the Nazis, like the Soviets, and like other, the American empires, to sort of tease out ways that perhaps the Japanese empire was more similar to some of these than others. So I will end.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think that I'm going to agree with Kelly here, and I want to speak more broadly about how the history of captivity we can think about that when we look at the experience of Allied POWs in Japan. And this will also allow me to briefly answer one of the other questions about gender, which is, either usually having that question in the audience about Japan or gender. So I just want to think about captivity as something that is characterized by the absence of combat. And so that the way that I look at the gender history of this time is that is looking at what masculinity is and manliness is. And since these things are essential to heroism, right? And when in a POW camp, there was very little opportunity to demonstrate this, right? And what you see instead are shrinking bodies and everyday humiliations at the hands of Japanese men. And I think it's also, when there are women's stories that come up in histories, it's important to include them. And that, in this case, is really about internee women, and I cover that in my book. So I apologize for going a little bit off the question, but.
No, I'm glad you brought that in, because there was a question from Joseph Seeley about the tendency of imperial histories to be gendered male and how do women's stories come in. So Rana, I'll give you the last word.
Yep. So I think I'd like colleagues in other fields, and I talked to many of them on this subject, to take away two things, really. One is to know that a subject of immense obsession for the European field, and to some extent the Japan field, the Second World War, is also a subject of immense interest in China itself. And the second point is that just as when in the present day, the British are obsessed with World War II and are talking about it endlessly on all sorts of occasions, they're not really talking about the reality of Germany, either in the 1940s or in the present day. They're really talking about Britain in the present day. And similarly, whenever the Chinese bring up the subject of the People's War or the World Anti-Fascist War or the bombing of Chongqing or whatever else it might be, they're not really talking about the Japan of 75 years ago. And they're certainly not talking about the real, actually lived Japan, the liberal, relatively, pacifist is too much, but nonetheless peace constitution maintaining economic giant, which is about as likely to go to war with anyone as San Marino. They're talking about something that is relevant to China in the 2020s. And when we realize that, I think it's important to be aware that while Sino-Japanese conflict is one of those things that for a whole variety of reasons we can't be entirely sanguine about, and there are dangers, in the end that Chinese conversation is not really, I think, for the most part about Japan as it actually is, but it is very much about China as it actually is.
So just to end this, I think this is wonderful. I want to thank the questions that came from the audience and all of you who turned out. I want to thank the authors of the books and especially the commentators. These were really wonderful comments. I want to thank Michelle Spivey and Dwayne Peck providing technical support at our end. Helping these things move along is so important. And thank you all. And I look forward to these conversations being continued in other venues.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Great to see you all.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.